Despite the protection of human rights being fundamental to our way of life, people in Australia are still vulnerable to abuse. Many live with their basic rights breached on a daily basis. On the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the federal government announced a national human rights consultation to gather opinions on how rights might be better protected. More than 40,000 Australians wrote submissions or attended public hearings, the largest community reaction to any consultation in the country's history.
One of the things which is very strong in the Australian ethos is the notion of the fair go, and there is a very strong concern about people who fall through the gaps or through the cracks, particularly those with mental disabilities, people who are homeless, the disabled and the aged.
There is a demonstrable need in the Australian community for stronger human rights protection. Now that need has been something that we have been researching here at UNSW, and we've also been linking in with a number of other researchers in Australia, not just in this state but throughout Australia and also internationally.
The committee, obviously we were drawn from as people of very different backgrounds. You had Mick Palmer, who'd been Federal Police Commissioner, Mary Kostakidis, who'd been very prominent as a national newsreader and involved in quite a lot of civil liberty type issues and the Republic debate, and Tammy Williams, a young Indigenous lawyer from Queensland. Tammy had been involved on the Howard Government's National Indigenous Council, and myself, who'd been involved in a whole range of issues, particularly on Indigenous and refugee rights here in Australia, and issues to do with human rights in places like Cambodia and East Timor. So quite a mix. Mary Kostakidis was fond at times of announcing that there she was, a well-known atheist, in a committee which was being chaired by a Jesuit priest. So we had a broad range of views.
The committee's final report made 31 recommendations. The most controversial, that Australia should adopt a Charter of Human Rights and give the High Court the power to declare laws incompatible.
Those who would be opposed to a Human Rights Act rightly point out that Australia is a pretty good place to live in, and that there are lots of complexities with our federal constitution, and that also in terms of Victoria and the ACT, that it's early days, they've got charters, why not wait for some time, see if there are any real benefits that flow from them. For example, can we say that life in Victoria is now better than it is in New South Wales, or vice versa? So those sorts of questions get put forward by the opponents. Those who are in favour of any sort of Human Rights Act often point to the fact that, of course, Australia is now one of the few Western democracies that doesn't legislate in this sort of way, and would raise questions about whether or not we're going to have judicial isolation from the rest of the world. And now that Victoria and the ACT have charters or the equivalent, what are we going to have in terms of consistency within the Federation? So they're some of the interesting questions, and questions on which I might say the Gilbert and Tobin Centre was very eloquent in putting submissions to us.
Look, I think this is, if it were to occur, would be one of the most significant reforms in public law in Australia's history. What a Bill of Rights does is focuses, and this is really its main focus, is on improving the policies, in other words, the structures of government decision-making, making them first more accountable to individuals who are the subjects of those decisions, but secondly, it requires individual public servants to view their powers and their duties through what might be described as a human rights prism or a human rights filter. So they must consider, whenever they're making a decision, what would be the likely human rights impact of that decision.
There are examples of departments having policies that abrogate human rights for no good reason. So, for example, a report a few years ago found that migration agents were in a habit of picking up suspected non-citizens on a Friday, keeping them over the weekend because no one was there to process them on the Monday, discovering those citizens and releasing them. So people were detained for 3 days for no good reason.
In the field of human rights, the key must always be on preventing the abuse from occurring, because once someone's human rights have been violated, there's a real limit to what the law and the legal system and government more generally can do.
People with disability have been a forgotten element of social policy and human rights protection for a long time, and that was demonstrated quite clearly in the recent developments of the United Nations with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. They were the hidden element of human rights protection. And so the consultation has been the opportunity to bring that debate home. Australia ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability in July 2008, and with that brought an energy to including disability into the debate. So the national consultations were an incredibly important advocacy tool to demonstrate that people with disability experience human rights abuses on a daily level in their inability to be able to access and participate in society. And there needs to be mechanisms so they don't maintain an invisibility and so they can be active participating members of the society.
What was taken off the table at the outset was the possibility of constitutional change. Instead, the consultation committee said the dialogue model, already operating in Victoria and the ACT, should be the template for any new Human Rights Act. Under the model, the High Court would be able to declare laws inconsistent and send them back for redrafting. The final say, however, would rest with Parliament.
Those opposed to a Bill of Rights often have some quite persuasive arguments as to why we shouldn't have a US-style Bill of Rights, or why a Bill of Rights in a country like Zimbabwe might not be successful. And I agree with those arguments. What seems a little bit lacking on that side is a really close analysis of what this particular model of Bill of Rights would look like if we had it at the federal level in Australia. And of course, we already have it at the state level in Victoria and in the ACT. So when you hear stories about rampaging judges who are accreting enormous amounts of power to themselves and terrorising parliamentarians, it seems especially mythical when you think that in Victoria and the ACT, and for that matter in the UK and New Zealand, you don't have anything of the sort. And it doesn't take a particularly long car journey in Australia to actually check that out.
There's obviously been some fear-mongering, but that also is part of the democratic process. What's been interesting is, of course, that as well as the fear-mongering, there have been some very strong campaigns that have been run. And so we've had campaigns being run in favour of a Human Rights Act by groups like Amnesty and Get Up, and we've had campaigns being run by groups like the Australian Christian Lobby against a Human Rights Act. And all of this, I think, is part of the ebb and flow. We've always said anyone who makes a submission, they're all to be treated equally. Doesn't matter whether they come through a campaign or they do it individually. But we also have to take into account the political reality that campaigns do make a difference in these sorts of issues.
The report is now in the public domain, and there is bound to be more debate to come. The government has said it will respond to the Brennan Report's recommendations by the end of the year.
I think any federal government would have to take this report or this series of consultations seriously, not because of what we've written or who we are as committee members, but when you have over 35,000 citizens putting in submissions to an inquiry, and more to the point, when you have over 6,000 people coming through the doors to engage in 2-hour consultations, giving up their time, I think that's a fair indication that there is some community sentiment out there. So I think it would be good for government to be attentive to those sorts of issues. But mind you, in where and which way government acts, there are a lot of very complex constitutional, federal, state issues to be addressed, and on those sorts of questions I would think there'll be some very detailed considerations to be made by government before we get a full response.
I'd like to see an Australia that protects human rights and that provides fair treatment to all people in our society, not just the majority but also the minority and the disadvantaged and marginalised. I think a Human Rights Act is the best way to do that. I'd like a Human Rights Act to be a symbol for Australians of the things that we hold most valuable in our society.
The federal government has rejected the recommendation of its own inquiry on human rights. It's decided not to set up a charter enshrining civil liberties. Instead, the Attorney-General promises tougher parliamentary scrutiny of human rights issues and an education program.
It's nearly 7 months since Jesuit lawyer Father Frank Brennan recommended the government set up a Charter of Human Rights, so the Attorney-General was keen to dispel any false hopes.
Let me say at the outset, and lest it be an anti-climax,